Hello, colleagues. I'm going to be doing a 10 to 15 minute presentation that gives a pretty good overview of my graduate research project. I'll try to keep it closer to 10 minutes, but there's a lot here, and a lot of you have already heard parts of this presentation, so I'll try to skip over areas that you might already be familiar with. Let me share my screen, and I'll get started. All right. So my graduate research project is on the Stewart Mountain Community Forest, and I will be going over a lot of different components of this project, but it's important to remember this fundamental research question. How can community forestry help restore the Nooksack watershed and recover native salmonid populations? Which model is most appropriate in the Mount Baker foothills? So those are two questions, but they're really getting at the same question, which is how can stakeholders here in Whatcom County use community forestry to advance numerous ecological objectives, and in particular, recovering salmonid populations, which are salmon and steelhead and other native fish, such as bull trout and others, how forestry can help recover those fish populations. Here's the outline of my presentation. This looks like a lot, but it's not too much. 4 components. I'll start by going over some of the hydrologic impacts, the water impacts that are associated with industrial forestry. Then I'll quickly go over what community forestry is and how it differs from industrial forestry. Then I'll talk about the Stewart Mountain Community Forest and what it is. And I will conclude the presentation with a brief overview of what my research project will entail, the different phases associated with the project. So starting at the top, what is industrial forestry? Well, you all have probably heard me talk about industrial forestry, and it's important to define what we're talking about. Put simply, it's clear-cut plantation forestry that involves intensive logging practices, extensive road networks, short logging rotations. Here is satellite imagery over the last 30 years. So over the course of my lifetime, this is what Washington's state forest practices have looked like. To slow it down a little bit, this is Stewart Mountain, and my house is right here on the right side of the screen. You can see where I live in Van Zandt. Here's the South Fork Nooksack River. Here's the North Fork, and they collide into the main stem. This is Stewart Mountain, and you can see over the last 25, 30 years, most of the mountain has been slicked away, and what is left is clear cuts like this. This is a clear cut on Stewart Mountain. I took this photo a few months ago. This is one of the more recent ones. And then there's plantations. So densely packed Douglas fir trees. This is not really a forest as much as it is a crop that is intensively managed for a singular purpose, which is timber production. And these forests are generally logged every 35 to 40 years. So what are the problems associated with that kind of forestry? Well, clear-cut plantation forestry can contribute to warmer stream temperatures, higher turbidity, that's the amount of sediment in the water. So there's more mud and sediment in streams adjacent to clear-cut areas. There's more landslides, more mass wasting events. There's higher peak flows in the winter, so that's where flooding and erosion can come into play. So the peak flow is the max flow in the winter, and then industrial forestry also means the polar opposite of that in the summer. where there's too little water during the summer months. This is corroborated by dozens of scientific studies over the past 70 years. Some of these studies have documented the impacts of clear-cut plantation forestry in the same watershed over time. Most notably, there are these two studies that came out recently in the last few years that documented 60 years of data in 3 different locations in the Pacific Northwest. And they found that when comparing the logged to the unlogged forest, the unlogged forest was producing 50% more water in its streams during the summer than the logged forest. So in other words, they found through a variety of means that clear-cut plantation forestry contributed to half as much water during the summer months. And that deficit, that water deficit, lasted and persisted for numerous decades. And they're not actually able to tell when it ends, but it lasts at least 4 decades after clear-cut, potentially more. Very, very big finding, and it has very major implications for the Nooksack watershed. Because this watershed has been dramatically impacted by clear-cut plantation forestry. So since settlers, European settlers came west in the 19th century, the Nooksack watershed has been subjected to very intensive forest practices. And in particular, over the last 75 years, the watershed has seen very aggressive industrial forest practices that have reduced salmon populations to the point that some of the runs are nearing extinction and may go extinct in the years to come. Numerous species that depend on salmon are also in decline. Most notably, the orca whale, the southern resident orca whale population has seen a steady decline. And the fundamental reason every scientist is in uniform agreement is Chinook salmon is also declining and is contributing to the orca whale's decline. The last point I want to make here is that the South Fork Nooksack River, which is one of the 3 forks of the watershed, it's this one that runs. Here's the confluence with the North Fork. So that's where Deming, Washington is. You can see Van Zant, where I live. Here's Stewart Mountain on the left. The South Fork Nooksack River is the most impaired, and it's the fork that is most the highest priority for restoration. It's been most impacted by forestry and in agriculture. So you can see this is a Department of Ecology map that shows in red the areas that are too warm, according to the state's own guidelines that are informed by the Clean Water Act. So the South Fork Nooksack River is violating the Clean Water Act under numerous provisions for temperature, for sediment, and for the lack of water in the summer. All right, so that's the South Fork, and I've gone over industrial forestry. So what are the alternatives? Well, there are other ways to produce wood products, believe it or not. There are actually many different approaches. And community forestry is a broad umbrella term that describes more of an approach, less of specific prescriptions. It's more of an approach that involves multiple values, a long-term commitment to forest stewardship that focuses on values such as watershed quality, wildlife habitat, carbon storage, recreational access, research potential, and other values. Each community forest is different. And the cool thing about community forestry is that by definition, the community needs to be involved, stakeholders need to collaborate, and they all decide what to do with the forest, how the forest will be managed. And generally, when stakeholders come together and make decisions about how a forest should be managed, they all collectively decide not to do what the timber industry usually does. They instead decide to practice more of an ecological forestry approach. To give you a quick snapshot of what that means, how it differs from industrial forestry, this chart I developed specifically for this presentation, and it shows the differences in the approaches. On the left, industrial forestry; on the right, ecological forestry. One requires and entails clear cutting, the other selective thinning. While industrial forestry entails short rotations, 35 to 45 years, ecological forestry lets trees grow longer before harvest. Industrial logging generally is uniform and even aged, meaning the entire stand is going to be one single age. Whereas ecological forestry, since it's practicing that thinning approach, is going to have a multi-aged complex forest structure. Industrial forestry also is homogeneous biologically, whereas ecological forestry promotes biodiversity, a diversity of species that are being planted. The rest is pretty obvious. Clear-cut logging doesn't leave a lot of trees along streams. They really just follow the minimum state requirements. Ecological forestry strives to increase the amount of trees that are left around waterways. And lastly, ecological foresters try to minimize the amount of logging that takes place on steep slopes, which are more prone to landslides and erosion. So now that we've talked about industrial forestry, we've talked about the South Fork, we've talked about what community forestry is, let me give you a snapshot of the Stewart Mountain Community Forest. Here it is. I took this picture standing on Stewart Mountain, looking to the east. You see the Sisters and you see the Van Zandt Dike, and below is where I live in the South Fork Nooksack River Valley. To show you from a different perspective, I live here in Van Zandt. The blue on this map are DNR state lands, and if they're not highlighted in the color, then they're private. You can see what I just highlighted here in red is the proposed Stewart Mountain Community Forest. It would encapsulate roughly half of Stewart Mountain, which is a big mountain. You can see one half of Stewart Mountain is on the Lake Whatcom side of the watershed. This is on the eastern slopes of Stewart Mountain. And like I said, 6,000 acres. It's currently privately owned, but we're trying to get it to be adopted into public ownership. Here's a different view showing, once again, where I live. Here's Stewart Mountain, and there's Bellingham in the distance. That's Lake Whatcom. So my proposal for my research project is to figure out which version of community forestry is most appropriate for Stewart Mountain. There are a variety of variables that I'll be looking at. Who owns the forest? Is it the state? Is it the county? Is it a tribe? How is the forest governed? Is it a board? Is it a committee? How are they appointed? How is the community engaged? And how is the forest actually managed? What kinds of silviculture and forestry is actually taking place? My research project will entail 4 phases that help me ascertain some of the answers to my questions. The first phase will be an inventory, where I will document every single community forest in the Pacific Northwest, mostly in Washington, but I'll look at a few in Oregon. And once I've documented those, I will then build a profile of each case example. And I'll only be choosing 4 to 5 case examples to look at based on their quality. So I'll be making decisions about which ones to choose based on how they're different. Then I'll analyze the advantages and drawbacks of each approach, and I will conclude with making a recommendation to the stakeholders who I'm currently working with to develop this community forest. So that's the end goal, is to produce a product that is actually helpful for people on the ground doing this work. And this is a picture I took last night. Me and my dog went up to the Van Zant Dike, which is on the eastern side of the valley, and looked over at Stewart Mountain, at where the community forest was, and enjoyed the sunset. Very beautiful place, and I'm excited to tell you all more about it in the coming months. Hopefully we all get to go check it out at some point. It's a really awesome place, and as you can tell, very, very dear to my heart. Thanks.